Mike, I think we can get started, okay? Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our cultural treasure, the Peacedale Museum of Art and Culture. I'm Lisa Fiore, President of the Board of Trustees for South County's oldest museum. This year, we are celebrating our 134th year. The museum's mission is education. Oh, here's Karen. We know the importance of early education for young children from pre-K to 5th grade. Our talented education director and our vice president, Mary Cocroft Brown, works hand in hand with our gifted fellow board members, Louise Weaver, Linda Hennessy, Betsy Cook, Jan Rothstein, and our administrator, Julie Wardwell. Their workshops are creative, engaging, and informative. They also host OLLI group tours of the museum gallery and walking tours of historic Peacedale Mill Village. Our wonderful evening speaker series is curated by fellow trustee Karen Ellsworth, who just walked in. Karen also researches and writes our first-rate newsletters. The museum trustees strive to keep history alive, in particular local history. Tonight is our last spring presentation for this year, and we look forward to our 2026 Fall Speaker Series. So tonight we welcome back public historian Robert A. Geake. Robert has spent the last 30 years immersed in Rhode Island and New England history and authored not 15 but 17 books. Tonight's presentation recounts the harsh realities of war during the American Revolution. Researching primary sources, Robert will explore the challenges soldiers faced. These soldiers are some of our country's unsung heroes that we should recognize and honor. Let's give a warm welcome to public historian Robert A. Geake. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here again. Thank you, Karen, for inviting me back. And this is such a wonderful museum, and it really is a treasure. So it's always a pleasure to be here. So my talk tonight is called Citizens for the First Time, the Contributions of New England Communities to the Cause of Liberty. So by the Revolutionary War era, as we know, the 13 colonies of British North America retained separate identities through law, currency, and customs. Each upheld their own system of law and justice. Each printed their own currency, and long-standing tiers of hierarchy were only just beginning to topple, especially in New England. Colonial governments had developed under an overseer or governor of Great Britain's appointment, save for Rhode Island, whose lively experiment of self-governance had withstood for over a century. The remaining colonies' freeholders or property owners were allowed to elect town councilors, sheriffs, and constables to limited terms, and representatives, as we did, to the General Assembly or to town councils. And the law really flourished during this period, when inhabitants were at liberty to take neighbors to court for trespass, for stealing, even slander. Moreover, disputes over property were settled in the courts, as were debt and social issues such as hardship and disability with aging. And such time-honored liberties for freeholders to pursue justice through the court system was certainly the foundation for their allegiance to the fight for independence. With the Declaration of Liberty and the subsequent War of Independence, those freeholders in the colonies were called upon to become citizens for the first time, to unite in one great cause from the wealthiest towns to the humblest of communities. All were called to sacrifice, husbands, sons, brothers of the community, who would often be sent far from home, to help provide funds and provisions needed to sustain the Congress and the Army through the difficult years, and through the work of individuals and artisans, crafting, weaving, sewing, laundering, and often housing stricken soldiers. So this talk will reveal how communities throughout New England, and particularly in southern New England, responded during the Revolutionary War to the demands of Congress and the depths to which these villages and towns gave of their own lives and livelihoods to the cause of liberty. The service and sacrifice of citizens is what we naturally think of when we first consider a community's contribution to the war. The American War of Independence was in fact a young man's war. And as in later wars, these men from all walks of life enlisted in local militias, and then as the conflict escalated into war, freely joined the Continental Army. New England communities had lost men in those first battles of the conflict. Some 100 Rhode Island men had been taken captive in the failed siege of Quebec in December 1775. The following summer, many more were taken prisoner in the failed battle for Manhattan. But when Washington reformed the hosts of militia units into the Grand Army of the Republic in January 1776, the initial strength was just over 15,500 men. By July, with the fervor from the Declaration of Independence running high, another 10,000 had enlisted, bringing the strength of the Army to roughly 25,600 soldiers. Most of these were year-long enlistments, leading to a major reorganization in October 1776, as Washington faced losing nearly half of the men by the close of December. In fact, the losses in battles for New York that had taken place during the summer and the fall of Fort Washington in November provided Great Britain with 3,000 prisoners of war, most of whom were to suffer a ghastly fate. These men would suffer for months in the sugar houses of the city, old and drafty warehouses left over from the colony's Atlantic trade. At Harlem, a long line of prisoners had been herded into a handful of farm buildings where they waited for 2 days before being given any bread or water, and then were marched to the city. And when the sugar houses were filled, churches and meeting halls were confiscated to serve as prisons. Now, while Continental officers were taken prisoner as well, these were treated as gentlemen according to the European custom in wartime. This meant that they could share close quarters with other imprisoned officers in one of the mansion houses that survived the bombardment of the city, and allowed to wander about the city on their honor, that they would return to their house of imprisonment at curfew, which was usually at dark. As they could walk about the city, some of these officers made an effort to visit the churches and other prisons and report on the condition of the enlisted men. Well, what they found shocked them. Captain Alexander Graydon would write mournfully of, quote, "those abodes of human misery and despair," end quote, where thousands of my unhappy countrymen are perishing under the hand of a proud, unfeeling authority. The American officers taken prisoners debated about what to do. They considered writing a letter to General Howe, but then voiced concerns about repercussions possibly to the officers, and reasoned that Howe surely knew of the conditions already of the British prisons. Ethan Allen, one of these officers, who had returned to New York after a year in prison in Great Britain, was determined to write such a missive after visiting the churches and the sugar houses. And he composed several rough drafts until the officers agreed to sign a version of the letter that would be sent with their own signatures to the British commander. But as his hand-wringing continued, conditions only worsened for the prisoners. As described by historian Edwin R. Burroughs in his work Forgotten Patriots, the bodies were piling up so rapidly that burial details fell further and further behind. 20 to 30 Americans died every day. A Connecticut soldier wrote sadly, "They lie in heaps unburied." On December 24, 1776, with great fanfare as a humane act of kindness, General Howe ordered the release of American prisoners in New York. While this act was certainly created to relieve pressure on the maintenance and man-hours required to run the prisons, undoubtedly the cruelest act committed against those Americans held on their day of release was when Provost Marshal William Cunningham ordered the bread that was given to prisoners before they were released to be poisoned, reckoning that the majority would die before they ever reached their home. Cunningham had been abused by a mob for being a Tory by the Sons of Liberty, and he had slowly taken out his vengeance over the years as Provost Marshal, and especially with his final act, a war crime among others for which he was never brought to justice. On that morning, 225 prisoners were collected on the Albany Pier and placed aboard the Glass Cow, coincidentally a ship that had been detained in Providence earlier in the month. It had been hired by the British to transport the prisoners from New York to Milford, Connecticut. More than 24 men died during the week-long journey. Literally left on the beach, the emaciated men straggled into town and told their names and stories to the shocked villagers they encountered. The citizens then did all they could for the released prisoners. They took some of the 100 of the sickest of their men into their homes to nurse them. But despite their efforts, the prisoners were in such poor condition that almost half the number who had survived would die in the coming weeks. Others died on the journey home, and some brought disease and death with them. Oliver Babcock returned to his Connecticut family, and one of his first acts on returning home was to write a note of thanksgiving in his diary, desiring that from then on he, quote, live to honor and praise God all the days of my life, end quote. He met with Governor Trumbull and his council on January 7, 1777, where he related the sufferings of his fellow prisoners in New York, but then died less than 2 weeks later from the smallpox he had contracted while imprisoned. His death was followed shortly after by 2 of his children, who had become sickened upon his return. It is estimated then that some 1,800 American prisoners were released that December. Another release would occur in February 1777. And historian Burroughs reflects on the cumulative effect the tragedy had on New England communities. Of the 36 men from Litchfield, Connecticut, who helped defend Fort Washington, 4 were killed and 32 were taken prisoner. 20 died in the prisons of New York, another 6 on the way home. Only 6 men lived to return to Litchfield. A company of 100 men raised in Banbury, Connecticut, was captured at Fort Washington and confined in one of the sugar houses. 2 of them survived. Some towns may have lost everyone. Such loss was devastating to New England families, and not surprisingly, the fervor for enlistment soon abated, and throughout the war it was a constant struggle to man the conflict against Great Britain. This was undoubtedly the greatest, but just one of many of the concerns that the fledgling army faced as it challenged one of the greatest empires in the world. Of great alarm was the apparent lack of firearms and ammunition in many communities at the beginning of the war. In those years preceding the American Revolution, most men who did own guns in the colonies carried at least a fowling gun, an early long-barreled predecessor of the rifle, for hunting fowl, as the name implies, or smaller game. Those in remote or wilderness areas might own a buck and ball rifle for hunting deer or moose, or to protect livestock from larger predators. As the generations passed into the pre-revolution era, regions shrank as the colonies became more enveloped in the widening world of goods and commerce. Even rural communities had little left in the form of woodlands. A coach carrying visitors through the region from one town to another by 1770 would have seen mills along every river, and beyond those towns a horizon of pasture and orchards hewn quilt-like on the land. It was only when beyond these pastures at the woodlands leading into the hills and mountains that one saw what wilderness did remain. Aside from these muskets left over from the 18th century indigenous wars that were kept by families, the use of such guns was now mainly for sportsmen and produced as such by the gunsmiths throughout New England. Dedicated hunters still travel to northern New England, as they do today, to hunt deer, moose, and bear. The New England rifles crafted then were described by historian Lindsay as a practical and conservative tool for everyday use. The small amount of embellishment is executed in good taste. The New England gunsmith placed his emphasis on fine workmanship and the careful fit of wood to metal. Those made for heavier game held a barrel of at least 40 inches, with a heavy stock to absorb the recoil of a .45 caliber load of shot or a single ball. The straight cut rifling of the barrel allowed for an accuracy of up to 100 yards. Such rifles became the weapon of choice as militia units formed and practiced their marksmanship, but these were usually brought from home. Gun manufacturing was still in its artisan state. While there were several small factories in a few Massachusetts and Connecticut towns, gunsmithing was still largely an individual occupation, with little thought of expanding into large-scale manufacturing. Inventories of rural New England communities between the years 1750 and 1775 shows that of the 41 selected inventories of that period, but 16 households of 41 held firearms. What cannot be disputed is however many guns in their varied forms were in the hands of individuals, the stores of ammunition, firearms, and cannon were all in a neglected state at the start of the American Revolution. Each community had its own armory or powder magazine to store the town arsenal and gunpowder, though these also had been neglected during the years of peace after 1763. The town of Boston, Massachusetts had issued its last contract for weapons for the defense of the colony in 1745. Connecticut stores of arms were apparently so low that the colony issued a proclamation that men of the militia were required to furnish their own weapons. And this, I believe, was the key, that the lack of guns in households was partly due to the populace's belief that the towns had sufficient arms and powder should they be needed in an emergency, as the magazines were built to provide. In 1774, Rhode Island blacksmith Jeremiah Hopkins, who happened to be the brother of Governor Stephen Hopkins, moved from Scituate to Coventry and petitioned the state with his son Elisha to conduct a lottery which would earn them the sum of $200, which would be enough to outfit a workshop, so as to make guns and smaller arms with advantage to myself, he wrote, and others at this time when guns are so much wanted and not to be had from England. The proliferation of militia units, both regenerated and formed anew in the coming months, including independent companies throughout the colonies, made the manufacture and procurement of arms of critical importance. In most of the colonies, a committee of safety was formed, the first in Boston on October 27, 1774. Its numbers comprised of 3 men from the city and 6 others from surrounding counties. These took charge of the need of procuring weapons for militia and citizens alike. Even as the militia companies marched with their own weapons to Boston that spring, Rhode Island had resisted forming a committee. Why? Because Governor Joseph Wanton still sided with Great Britain. And that inclination led to a tug of war with the legislature until he was finally removed from office. The attempted raid on the magazines of Massachusetts met stiff opposition, particularly in Salem, where British regulars or lobsterbacks under command of Colonel Alexander Leslie were thwarted by civilians pulling up the drawbridge at the river. A gathering armed mob shouted threats across the water, which resulted in a British withdrawal. The resultant skirmishes at Lexington and Concord just a week later, on April 19th, only exacerbated the need for armaments for both militias and home defense. Those men joined with the militia of their own towns and villages in the colonies in the march to Cambridge that would be conscripted into the Continental Army and then lay siege to Boston. One privateer recorded the recollections of a British officer who said that the road from New York to Boston was covered with men who were going to join the rebel forces under command of General Washington. And he wrote, "Those men, thus on their march, were what they called militia. Some of them were clothed in rags with a knapsack or something like that on their backs. Each in hand had an old rusty musket up on their shoulders, some of which, observed, had no locks in them." The town of Providence, Rhode Island, assigned Benjamin Thurber the task of supervising the repair and assembly of muskets for the town. Thurber would also act as an agent for a network of gun manufacturers, as well as blacksmiths and woodworkers who could supply the necessary components to assemble a musket. During the summer of 1775, with the siege of Boston occupying the colony's forces, Thurber continued procuring the necessary stocks and hardware for needed arms. William Potter sold the gun sold the town 20 guns outright. Young gunsmith Thomas Bicknell produced 10 gun barrels, and Edward Martin manufactured and added to the town 54 sets of gun trimmings, 88 rods of swivels, and 119 sets of scabbards, hooks, and plates. Tanner Martin Thurber manufactured cartridge boxes, bayonet belts, scabbards, and gun trimmings for the town. One bill alone accounted for 51 cartridge boxes and 102 bayonet belts. Christopher Barney also produced 26 sets of gun trimmings at his Providence shop. Outside of occupied Boston, Massachusetts gunsmiths kept occupied producing arms for the troops laying siege to the town. Most had brought their firearms from home. The Committee of Safety in Massachusetts contracted with some 37 musket makers scattered from Attleboro to Bridgewater to North Brookfield and Sutton. In November 1775, the Continental Congress encouraged the colonies to, quote, keep their gunsmiths at work, and specified the weapon they desired, good flintlocks with bayonets for the army. And they specified each flintlock is to be made with a good bridle lock, 3/4 of an inch bore, and of good sustenance at the breech, the barrel to be 3 feet 8 inches in length, the bayonet to be 8 inches in the blade with a steel ramrod, the upper loop thereof to be trumpeted. So Congress required that each musket manufactured for troops of the Continental Line be stamped with the letters CR. Desiring to control and ensure quality, some states required the manufacturer to account for their origin. Some of the earliest Massachusetts Bay gunsmiths stamped MB upon the barrel near the lock. Connecticut required the name or initials of the gun maker to be stamped upon the gun. And the state also took the step of impounding guns, stamping the owner's initials with a promise of payment in due time. Rhode Island, meanwhile, required that all guns manufactured in our state be stamped with the state coat of arms. Local artisans throughout the colonies soon adapted to the need for guns and took advantage of the opportunity. And these artisans became valued in their communities, struggling to support the war. As the war entered its second year, the Continental Army was better armed beyond the fowling pieces and ball and buck muskets brought by citizens to battle. In the 3 years before the alliance and purchase of weapons from France placed European weapons once again in American hands, communities of craftsmen had kept the Continental Army, militias, and citizens well armed. Many of these joined the soldiers in arms against the British, and a good number of foot soldiers and officers continued to use customized muskets and rifles brought from their own hometowns. The gunsmiths had developed skills they never knew they had under the emergency of the call to arms in the American Revolution. Patriot citizens at home also contributed to the cause in numerous ways. Farmers contributed livestock and produce, wheat for flour, and corn for fodder to the Army of the Great Republic. Yeomen willingly contributed at first, earning prices that Congress had settled upon, but these were dependent upon payment by the states and often paid to the farmers in arrears. And Stephen Hicks of Warwick, for instance, had brought in 2 tons of hay for the use of the Army in February 1777, but he wasn't paid the 12 pounds due to him until 2 years later. The state also procured provisions by eminent domain. In 1778, the Council of War also ordered Giles Pierce of New Shoreham, or Block Island, to, quote, bring over to the Main any kinds of provision, fish, grain, wool, yarn, stockings, tallow, or oil he could obtain from the island's households. Throughout the conflict, the Rhode Island Council of War heard and approved requests for payment from a wide variety of goods, services, and on occasion the lending of equipment, as in January 1778, when the council ordered that Mrs. Elizabeth Thurston be paid the 30 shillings for her wheelbarrow that had been taken for use of the people working the lines. That same month, the council authorized the payment of 25 pounds, 4 shillings to Timothy Hopkins, Esquire, for stockings by him collected in the town of Scituate. And there are other authorizations for payment for stockings collected in Providence, North Kingstown, and Smithfield. And they also included Job Comstock of East Greenwich and Such collectors, as they were termed, were the merchants or distributors authorized to obtain clothing for the Rhode Island troops and militia. As such, their contracts were dependent upon an entire network of clothiers, darners, seamstresses, and shoemakers in their communities. They were overseen in this time period by John Reynolds, who was the council's designated agent clothier. In February 1778, he was authorized to use 3,000 pounds in loan office certificates to purchase a quantity of blankets and clothing for the use of the army. The uniform of the Rhode Island regiments is best described in the order issued in the spring of 1778. This was just before the formation, or just at the time of the formation, of the 1st Rhode Island, or Black Regiment. And so the order calls for nearly 500 hunting frocks, breeches, wool hats, stockings, and shoes. The militia required to guard the shorelines in Rhode Island and other places largely had to do with whatever uniform could be made from the clothing repaired from home or acquired from clothing made and donated by women of the communities. Such clothing needed crucially to be replenished during the changing seasons. The wear and tear on shorts and breeches, the necessity of stockings in cold weather, the toll of footwear due to endless marching was significant. And my friend Norm Desmarais recently told me that the average life of a shoe during the Revolutionary War was 3 weeks. That's how much marching they had to do. For those who supplied the army, the battle was continued throughout the war. For those along the New England coastline, it seemed no matter the size of guard or how carefully patrolled, raids came in droves, whether in winter or summer. A brief summary of losses from British raids that occurred in communities during the war demonstrates the loss communities suffered, even as Congress demanded more goods. To give but a few examples, in April 1777, New York governor and loyalist William Tryon led a group of loyalists from British force to raid Danbury, Connecticut, destroying some 1,800 barrels of beef and pork, 700 of flour, 2,000 bushels of grain, and other provisions collected for the rebel forces. The following year of 1778 was especially successful, with British raids from coasting vessels affecting New Bedford and Fairhaven, Massachusetts. Rhode Island itself saw the loss of some 60 to 70 head of cattle and 900 sheep plucked from Prudence Island in Narragansett Bay. In September of that year, a raid on Martha's Vineyard netted some 10,000 sheep, some from the already destitute indigenous people of Gayhead, as well as 300 oxen. In 1779, the British returned and requisitioned from the islanders' growing season some 900 hogs, 137 bushels of grain, 698 heads of cabbage, as well as leather, lumber, and other provisions. A raid on the town of Royalton the following year burned dwellings and destroyed 16 new barns filled with hay, slaughtered about 125 cattle, and all the sheep and swine they could find. And on it went throughout the war, both loyalists and rebel militia destroying property and provisions and partisan plundering of those farmers whose sympathies lied with American forces, or those loyalists who had supported British troops during an occupation and were left vulnerable and defenseless in the wake of their departure. Through all these challenges, both citizen and soldier gave great sacrifice. Congress sought more ways in which to supply the Army. In February 1780, Congress called on the several states for specific supplies of provisions and forage, an action that would be eventually enforced through quotas for beef and produce, as were quotas for enlisted men. In Rhode Island, a committee was appointed by the General Assembly, and that committee found that the farms had not leased out had been rented, By November 1780, the committee would report that from the best information we have able to obtain, we find that 600 barrels of beef have already been purchased by the purchasing commissary, that 100 barrels will be furnished by the towns of Westerly, Richmond, and Hopkinton, agreeably to a resolution of this assembly, that 100 barrels may be expected in payments of rents for the state's farms, and that there will remain a deficiency of 200 barrels of beef to complete the state's quota. The Massachusetts General Court requisitioned some 2,445 pounds of beef from the towns within the state, and the towns responded in varying ways depending upon their situation. While the town of Amesbury, for instance, duly drove 33 oxen weighing approximately 900 pounds each to meet their quota, the town of Harwich in Barnstable County pled poverty and said that a drought had caused such shortages that only a quarter of the town's population had meat of any kind. Elsewhere, the town of Wells purchased 20,000 pounds of beef to contribute to their quota, while Wyndham voted instead to send cash. Vermont, which had yet to be considered a sovereign state by the Continental Congress, chose to stock their own garrisons. The continued reliance upon states for provisions began to take its toll on the communities who were expected to provide a set quota of goods for each state. While this reliance upon local towns and villages to provide for the troops and sustain militia may have been a boon to some local merchants and a handful of suppliers, it remained a hardship to local farms and households in the communities, many of whom were expected to open their barns and store wares for the army, and their homes to house officers, or to serve as hospitals for the sick, along with their churches, courthouses, and schools. Citizens often opened their homes to soldiers during the war, sometimes visiting officers, but more often to those who had fallen ill on the march or in a nearby encampment. One case of Richard Borden improving his house to be made into a hospital occurred in Providence, and the state paid him rent on the house, and there were commonly more than one or two soldiers in the home. And one case really came to light just a few years ago in the archives of the General James Mitchell Varnum Museum in East Greenwich, when curator and current president Patrick Donovan came across a handwritten letter from one of the black soldiers of the 1st Rhode Island Regiment that was addressed to his former master and mistress in January 1781. Thomas Nichols did not pen this letter to his former masters in his own hand. This was done willing by a medical aide that was helping with his case. For Thomas could not read or write, but for the N by which he signed the letter. Nichols had enlisted at the forming of the Black Regiment and took up training before the Battle of Rhode Island, put the new regiment to the test in their first engagement with British and Hessian troops. He had been assigned to Thomas Cole's company. He appears on the muster rolls of August 23, 1778, 6 days before the battle. But as Thomas Nichols had enlisted in May, he did not undergo the rigorous training at Valley Forge that others who had become part of the regiment had been given under Prussian-bred General von Steuben. This may have left him, along with the others who learned to use their weapons and the tactics of war within only a few months, unprepared for the battle to come. Whatever injuries or illness suffered by Nichols occurred during this time, he may have been ill on the day of the battle, as an outbreak of illness had swept through the troops even before the heavy rain soaked the encampment. By the next month, in September, he was listed as sick in hospital, and he was very sick indeed. He stayed in hospital until the following May 1779, but by November 3rd, he was back with the regiment when they landed in Newport after the British evacuation of the island. In October of 1780, Colonel Greene wrote to General Washington requesting a discharge of the battalion. They really wanted to get out of Rhode Island. This was not given to him. They remained in Newport while a detachment of French officers was sent to Newport, including Rochambeau. It's quite a lively time that they had in the months that they were there. But while they were there, a detachment of 4 French officers was sent from Newport that November to survey the route chosen for the Continental Army to pass along its march to the Connecticut River and then to West Point. This is the Marquis de Chastellux. And he wrote a 2-volume journal that's quite interesting to read about his time in America and in the Revolutionary War. And so on this particular journey, as he set out, he wrote in his diary, "I left Newport this day with M. Lynch and M. de Montesquieu, each of whom had a servant. I myself had 3, one of whom led an extra horse, and another drove a small cart which I was advised to take to convey my portmanteaus, and thus avoid hurting my riding horses." The French Major General would travel with his entourage along the route taken later by Continental officers. As he records, the roads along the route chosen were not always easily navigated. It was also meant to be a kind of reconnaissance mission. The Marquis always seemed to have a keen eye on the landscape as to where encampments and fortifications might be made. Making his way to Scituate, Rhode Island, he stayed with other officers at Angel's Tavern, and then moved on to a comfortable night at Governor Jabez Bowen's house in Providence. But he would record at the conclusion of the following day's journey on November 13th, 1780, "From this place," meaning Providence, to Voluntown, "the road is very bad. One is continually going uphill and downhill, and always with rough roads. It was 6 o'clock, and night had closed in when I reached Dorrance's Tavern, which is only 25 miles from Providence." The Marquis de Chastellux remained 3 days in Voluntown, albeit in the not unpleasant company of one Miss Pease, waiting for his cart to appear. When it did appear, he would write indignantly that, "It is proper to observe that my servants, proud of possessing ample means of transporting my effects, had loaded it with many useless articles. That I myself, being apprised that wine was not always to be met with at the inns, had thought proper to furnish myself with canteens, which held 12 bottles. And having taken further precaution to ask for 2 or 3 loaves of bread from Providence, had packed up 20, which alone weighed upward of 80 pounds, so that my poor cart was laden to the point of sinking." So Thomas Nichols, the young black man, along with 4 other men of his regiment, were on command to drive the wagons of this entourage over this same rough terrain. They would have endured an exhausting portage, given the Marquis's assessment of the baggage and supplies packed for the journey. The wagon train's greatest misfortune, as the Marquis would record, arose from striking on the rocks, which had broken one wheel and greatly damaged the other. After reducing his wagon to a smaller one, the entourage continued on to Plainfield, Connecticut, and then to Canterbury, a village that pleased the Marquis with its elegant homes. Leaving the pleasant streets of the village, however, you reach the woods and chain of hills crossed by rugged and difficult roads 6 or 7 miles further along. The country begins to open up again, and you descend agreeably to Windham. Now, still waiting for orders in Rhode Island, a detachment of the 1st Rhode Island Regiment was sent to guard stores in Providence in December, while the rest were recalled to their base encampment in East Greenwich. They all received a wagon load of new white uniforms in late December, and Colonel Greene finally received the orders to march and rendezvous with troops in New Haven on January 2nd, 1781. Nichols' letter is dated January 18th, 1781, though the medical attendant who took the dictation indicates that it was actually written on December 31st, 1780. From Nichols' letter, we are given to understand that he had little in the way of clothing. He and others had left Rhode Island without the benefit of this new clothing distributed to the other troops that December. The letter also seems to indicate that Nichols spent considerable time either trying to recover from what must have been a relapse of an ongoing condition or was sickened by another debilitating illness. In the letter, Nichols states that after driving the wagon with the other soldiers, he was overtaken by the, quote, old fits that had plagued him months before. When he informed his commander, he was stripped of his wagoneer duties and ordered to guard the wagons alone. He refused and left the wagons, followed by 2 others, and he walked all the way back to camp to complain. Colonel Greene then ordered the men back to their wagons, but as Nichols explained, he made it only as far as South Windham, when the suffering he had experienced since then made him feel that he was no longer fit for duty. This might easily explain the sickbed offered to him by a well-respected militia leader whose son also served in the Continental Line. Thomas Nichols spent weeks in the home of local militia leader Dan Murdoch of Windham County. It was there that he was examined by a doctor and tended to by a surgeon's mate who transcribed the letter dictated by the black soldier to his former owners in his surprising request. And part of his letter writes that, I am unable to go neither do I, let me start from the beginning, and I'll just read this. Honored master and mistress, I take this opportunity to inform you of my situation at this time and desire your aid. I have had a doctor and a surgeon's mate to me, which advised me to go to the Invalid Corps at Boston, where I may be under half pay during life, remaining to this poor state of body. But I ain't able to go neither, nor do I incline to go out with advice from you, but I have a desire that master and mistress would go to Colonel Green and see if you can get me discharged from ye war, it being very disagreeable to my mind as well as destructive to my health. I suppose I could ride on a horse or at least in a sleigh if you could obtain a discharge for me, so that I may return to my master and his family again, bearing the will of God and his pleasure. No more said at this time. I remain your humble and dutiful servant, Thomas. These incidents then would explain what occurred during de Chastello's and other officers' long wait for their wagons. The French had clearly left one of the servants given them in charge of the others. Could not then this breakdown of discipline when the roads were so tough not be expected? In the end, Colonel Green's orders in sending the men back to their wagons was obeyed, but the delay caused by Nichols' illness on return meant that he was left behind as the entourage moved on and was apparently bedridden for 6 weeks from the time of his illness to the time the letter was written on his behalf. And Nichols was not returned to the family who had enslaved him as he had expressed hopes in the letter. Instead, he was transferred to the Corps of Invalids in February 1781. And more than a year later, he would be the subject of a letter from Major General Benjamin Lincoln to General George Washington. And he wrote, I do myself the honor to enclose your excellency a certificate from Dr. Warren of Boston relative to the inability of a soldier there, is also an extract of a letter from Mr. Green on the subject. I saw the man when I was in Boston and supposed him quite unfit for the service, but did not think myself authorized to discharge him. And this is how we got the letter. That letter that was sent to Green eventually ended up in the museum at James Mitchell Varnum Museum. And that's how we got Thomas Nichols' letter. But whatever the circumstances, the letter is a unique account of a black soldier's experience as dictated by the soldier himself, notwithstanding the content of the letter and the plea to let him return to a life of servitude that seems remarkable to us as modern readers. But there's no doubt that his words reflected the thoughts and fears of a host of others enlisting for freedom, some who found the toil and danger too heavy a price. To his credit, Nichols had stood with his regiment at the Battle of Rhode Island, had suffered the trauma that would continue to afflict him later, but he never deserted as others might have done. The circumstances surrounding the writing of the letter also gives us a glimpse into how the war affected the communities. The Murdoch family were hardly alone in sheltering and caring for a sick or wounded soldier. Communities often paid families to do as much, as records throughout New England's historical societies will show. Such circumstances also appear in diaries published after the war. The Marquis de Chastellux came upon a similar situation 6 miles beyond Windham at a solitary little tavern kept by one Mrs. Hill. Asking for beds, the French officer and his junior officer were informed that there was only one spare bed in the house, the other being already taken by a sick traveler in the house who she did not want to disturb. Well, the traveler was a sick soldier of the Continental Army who had been given a furlough to return home for the benefit of his health. But he had neither a farthing in paper or hard money. but she had given him a good bed as he was too ill to continue his journey, and kept him and taken care of him for 4 days when de Chastellux came to visit. Well, the Marquis paid the money, in hard money, the boy's bill in hard money, and he gave some to the soldier as well to help him on his way, somewhat bemused by the effect that this had had on Mrs. Hill, who, like many, gave up their own charity for many soldiers far from home throughout the war. As the average age of a soldier during the War of Independence was 22, these veterans would become well known in their communities for their appearances in parades and ceremonies, and would be eulogized as soldiers of the Revolution when they died. The decade which likely yielded the greatest number of deaths of Revolutionary War veterans was also the decade in which the act allowing surviving militiamen or their heirs to apply for pensions for their service was passed in 1832. As a result, many veterans of the War of Independence received what meager pension Congress gave for but a few years before it passed to their heirs. The misfortune for others, of course, was to lose their life at so young an age. Their families' grief could only be expressed on gravestones where the departed service to country and community would be scripted elegantly for all time, as they surely wished, so that their fathers, brothers, and sons' deeds of valor and sacrifice would be remembered long after their own passing. Despite what was often an enormous loss to families and communities, despite the long protracted wait the veterans endured to be rewarded for their service, these families and the surviving men who served remained immensely proud throughout their lifetimes for their role in the War of Independence. Of the many who enlisted and served, willing to sacrifice their life for liberty, be they the sons of families settled a century in New England, or those humbler farmers' sons who threw down the plow and took up the musket, or those patriots of color within communities throughout southern New England, none expected a perfect union when the war was ended. But they all served for the great cause, as was the popular phrase at the time. That great cause was the liberty to decide their own future, to determine what path the American states would take by democratic process, and by that precedent, cement the liberties of the foundation of the Republic. To look for inspiration and guidance from the Declaration of Independence for the creation of, however slowly and haphazardly, the Constitution of the new nation, and the building of the United States as envisioned in that unique and historic document. We still look to the Declaration of Independence today for inspiration, hope, and determination that through both prosperous and precarious times, those words described by our founders promoting life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all Americans remain the responsibility of we the people to uphold, protect, and keep the great cause of liberty aflame in our own hearts, even as we remember the men who ignited that fire. Thank you. Thank you very much. Any questions or comments? No? Yes.
I have one question about the smallpox with, different areas. I know Rhode Island, particularly around Exeter, Richmond, and those areas, a lot of people were kept in the so-called pest houses.
Yes.
Because of smallpox. So in other parts of New England, was that also prevalent, for instance, in Connecticut and in Massachusetts, or was it pretty much stuck right here in Rhode Island?
Well, it was prevalent throughout New England. When Washington came to form the Army, Boston was in the middle of a smallpox outbreak. And one of his first and probably most important decisions was to have the soldiers inoculated. So that was always illness. And in my book, New England and the American Revolution, which I'm really sorry I don't have copies here. Amazon didn't live up to their promise. But this book does talk a lot about the different illnesses that soldiers faced and how they dealt with that. If you've read James Plum Martin, you've already read a little bit about the smallpox inoculation and the rash that he got from that, and how he and other soldiers put themselves in freezing water to relieve themselves of that rash, you know, that kind of thing. So there are always lots of illness to deal with. And yes, you had a question behind also.
Yes. What kind of wood did they use for their rifles?
Oh, that mostly I think they ran the gamut from oak and cherry, mainly hardwoods. You know, a gun needed to have good solid wood to save your shoulder from the repercussion of firing the weapon. Yeah.
Okay, and second question, Nichols, where were his owners?
They were in Warwick. They lived in Warwick. Yeah.
Okay.
Hmm.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm interested to know about the white uniforms. It just seems like it would be so impractical, you know, with these soldiers wearing white uniforms. Where would that decision be made to have the soldiers wearing white uniforms? It just seemed like that would just be the color you would not want.
Well, when the Rhode Island militias all gathered together and marched to Boston and took part in the siege of Boston, they were encamped next to a group of Maryland riflemen. And those Maryland riflemen all had hunting frocks for their uniform. They were taken by them because they were in Boston. You know, it was hot and it was also raining frequently. And these were the linen suits with the I don't know what you would call them. Anyway, they were designed so that the rain would wash off from them. You know, and so these hunting frocks, as they were called, were first adapted by the Rhode Islanders, and that was the first uniform they had, beyond the, you know, whatever else they could bring with them to the field of battle. And so they kept with that uniform, as you saw in 1778. And I always talk about this, especially with the Black Regiment. The image of the Black Regiment that everyone has are in those resplendent white uniforms with the teardrop-shaped helmets, leather-capped helmets with the teardrop-shaped placard in front of them. Those were not issued until that time period, December 1780, that I was talking about. Those new uniforms that they got in East Greenwich were those uniforms. So prior to that, in the Battle of Rhode Island, they had the hunting frocks, but a mishmash of other clothing. So those uniforms also were the cause of another French officer who had seen them crossing the New Haven River. He called them resplendent in their uniforms. He thought they were the best dressed outfit. Of course, they were brand new, you know, so they didn't get all dirty and everything. But you're right, it wasn't a very practical color, but it was what was issued. And you know, as you can imagine, how dirty they looked after a while. You know, the 2nd Rhode Island in particular, when their commander wrote and complained about the dirty, lousy regiment, meant that they were walking around in rags and all had lice. You know, so it was. It wasn't always. I take part in reenacting as part of the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment, and I only had started doing that when I was writing the book on the Rhode Island Regiment, because I thought, I'm writing about these men, I should go to ceremonies and pay my respects to them in this way. And so I started doing that. But what I didn't realize was that almost every other person dresses as an officer when they were, and you know, that just wasn't the case. When you go to a reenactment, you see half the men with these blue, you know, the blue uniforms on and everything, and that really was not the case throughout much of the war, you know. That was the prescribed uniform for the Continental Army, to have that blue coat, but not everybody got one. And when they did, sometimes it was late in the war. There's that famous painting that you probably may have seen by Don Troiani of the Black Regiment marching into Philadelphia with those uniforms. That's been at the State House for a while, and it's traveling around Rhode Island. So get to see that if you can, and that's a really nice impression of them marching into Philadelphia. That was on their way to Yorktown. So, yes?
Was the Black Regiment unique amongst the Continental Army?
It was unique. It was the first attempt to make a regiment comprised entirely of what would have been enslaved men. Now, they did not succeed. They only acquired about 120 to 140 slaves that enlisted. They filled the rest of the regiment by taking the black men who were in the integrated 2nd Rhode Island Regiment. Both Rhode Island regiments were integrated, and that in and of itself was also somewhat unique, but not totally unique. So those men then became part of the black regiment as well. And then, of course, there were indigenous men that enlisted, and a handful of indentured servants of European descent. So it was really an amalgamation, but they were always referred to as the Black Regiment. Even in pension papers, soldiers who were served with the Black Regiment, or soldiers who served even alongside the Black Regiment at the Battle of Rhode Island. I remember that man was in the Black Regiment of Colonel Greene, you know, that kind of thing. So it was a very prominent, Black Regiment was a prominent name among the Continental Army.
So after the war, would members of the Black Regiment who were black, would they go back to their state of enslavement, or what happened?
Some of them did, but it was a hard scrabble life. Caesar Updike ended up working on the same farm that had enslaved him. You know, others did the same throughout South County in particular. South County provided the most blacks for the Black Regiment of any other county. What was in Kings County. You know, so, yeah. And some of them had very unique situations. Prince Vaughan was unique, and as I'm looking through pension papers in my later work, more recently, I found Prince Vaughan to be the single black soldier who actually wrote out his own pension application and wrote letters for others as well who applied for pensions. The single black soldier that I found that was able to write their own
So where
pension.
was he from?
He was from North Kingstown.
Wow.
Yeah. Yes.
When did Maine branch off and not be part of Massachusetts anymore?
I don't recall. I don't recall. I know that Vermont was not a state. Vermont and New York were contention for property for a long time, and Vermont did not become a state until after the war. So yeah, officially, anyway. Yes.
Where do you find this material to do the research for all this material? Where do you find them?
Well, thankfully, a lot is online nowadays. You can download the War Council records, which I've done, and it's tedious, you know, reading through them, and all the orders and all the names and all the people in the different parts of the state. Also, for the Black Regiment of Forgotten Patriots is an essential volume that was published by the DAR in 2014, 2015, something like that. And that was really the impetus for me to start writing a book on the Black Regiment. I had written a history of the Narragansett, which is here, and I knew that the Narragansett had served in some ways in the war, but there was very, very little information until that book came out and showed the enlistment papers all there. And you know, you learn to look for enlistment papers, and the State Archives or Rhode Island Historical Society has great collections of papers by important people, as well as a Revolutionary War selection of documents as well. And Fold 3, which is an online associated with Ancestry.com, is also very helpful. You can actually download the actual pension papers, and you know that they've digitized, you know, and that's where that's really where you get the real stories. You know, you can look at the muster rolls, and you can look at the descriptions of battles and so forth. But what you really find out about the life of a soldier is really in the pension papers. When they're describing to someone who's writing it down for them what they went through during the war and where they were and how, you know. And even after the war, many of these soldiers were deeply affected. Some didn't even know that they could apply for pensions. There was one that I found, a man named, originally named Sharper Bors from Newport when he was a servant to John Bors. John Bors had promised him that he would be emancipated within 10 years, or by the time he reached 30. Sharper Bors opted to enlist in the Black Regiment and try to earn his freedom. He changed his name to Cato Bors, And throughout the muster rolls throughout the war, he's listed in, his last name is spelt in different ways, but he's listed throughout. He even served in Newport as well. And after he left, he did not apply for a pension, but his daughter did on his behalf. And she wrote he was living in the wilderness and had no idea that he could apply for a pension. And when he did find out, he had no friends around him that could write and relate and take down dictation. So she, on his behalf, had to gather what remaining fellow soldiers were and have them go to a judge, give their testimony, which would be then taken down, and then try to prove that. It took her amazing amount of time. She did not get his pension until she herself was 66 years of age. Because of delays where people thought that he had died, there was one document that said that related that he had died in Newport. Obviously a case of mistaken identity, but that was enough for the Council of Pensions to say, hey, wait a minute, maybe this man's an imposter. But the daughter was able to get enough evidence from people that had served with him, from people that knew him after the war, to get a pension finally. But many, many stories are like that. And you guys can imagine, it was more difficult for black veterans to get pensions than white veterans. Many of them could not read or write. So they had to go through that process of making an appointment with a judge, giving testimony, getting other friends to come forward and give testimony or have someone dictate what they recalled and so forth and so on. So I think it was quite difficult for blacks, and it's no surprise that of the many who served in the war, only 500 applications roughly for pensions were sent by black soldiers in the Revolutionary War.
And how many were sent by white soldiers?
Thousands,
Thousands.
yeah. Yes,
You know, a lot of the applications were filed by widows,
that's right.
and it was not unusual for widows to be illiterate either.
That's right. And they also had to prove they were married to the man.
Yes.
You know, it was a rigmarole, as they call it. And again, for blacks and indigenous people, this was even more difficult. There's one instance of a man named John Harry who had served, and this story will be published in a book later this year about Rhode Island and the Revolution. But this man named John Harry, he was an indigenous man, he had served, he applied for a pension. And what happened with the pensions was that initially when it was granted, 1818, that people who had served could apply for pensions, the pension office was flooded with applications. So they stepped back and said, well, we've got to make sure there's a need to give this money out. So then they sent investigators to follow up on pension applications, take inventories of your household. And if you were black, you had a broken stool, a table, you know, and it was very, very little in the way of material goods. But they would do this and then they would report back. And in this one particular case of John Harry, the investigator found that Harry and his wife were living in a home. And they also had a pasture that they were renting out for some money. And he wrote back and he said, well, they've got a home, they've got some money, income coming in. And the sachem of the Narragansett, named Augustus Harry at the time, no relation to John Harry, wrote a scathing letter to the investigators and to the government saying, this house belongs to the Narragansett people. This land belongs to the Narragansett people. We gave this house to the wife so that she would have a place to live. We take care of our elderly, unlike white people. And we've given them this land so that they could rent out for pasture and have a small income. But none of this belongs to them. When she dies, it will go to her, the son or daughter of her choosing. Because, of course, the Narragansett were matriarchal. And the investigators are coming at this from the patriarchal point of view. So all of this made it very, very difficult. But I'll tell you, Narragansett women stepped up and they really supplied the government with pages and pages of testimony. I know she's married to him. I went to her wedding at this man's house and these people were there. you know, so of course, they gave her the pension in the end. But it was just one reflection of how difficult it could be.
How much was the pension?
It was like $8 a month or something like that, yeah.
And was it really paid out on a regular?
It was. Generally, they did pay out the pensions. But it took so long. I mean, after the war, we had that long, protracted fight with Rhode Island especially leading the way against any kind of taxes that would pay for pensions. You know, so it took a long, long time. And so many, unfortunately, of those veterans never saw their pensions. The widows did, as you said, or the heirs might have seen some money in the end. Yes?
So did it pass down through generations? Was that pension once the soldier died, or?
It could go to the second generation, yes. Yeah.
Did they get it right away when the war was?
No, they had to go through a process as well to prove they were the son of,
65 or whatever, something to get.
Right.
You know, like that, yeah.
yeah. And so they had to go through a process to prove they were the heir, you know, that kind of thing. Elisha Potter actually helped a number of these veterans get their pensions. He took on their cases when they needed an attorney. Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure being here again. Thank you.
For those of you interested, Robert has his books up here for sale, $20 each. He has 5 different books available here. Everybody have a great summer. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
See you in the garden.